Amid the untamed beauty of Montana's Rocky Mountains, Emma Caldwell's life was one with nature. Raised by her grandfather, a retired park ranger, she learned the language of the wild, how to read animal tracks, identify bird calls, and respect the delicate balance of life in the wilderness. The mountains were her playground, and the creatures of the forest her silent companions. On a brisk winter morning, Emma set out on a routine hike near her grandfather's cabin. Snow blanketed the ground, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. As she traversed a narrow path, she noticed a disturbance in the snow. Following the tracks, she came across a small, trembling figure. A grizzly bear cub. It was alone, vulnerable, and shivering uncontrollably. Emma looked around, scanning the tree line for any sign of the cub's mother. Hours passed, and there was no sign of her. Though she knew the risks of intervening, Emma couldn't abandon the helpless creature. She wrapped the cub in her jacket and carried it back to the cabin. Her grandfather, Henry Caldwell, was initially apprehensive. "Emma, a grizzly cub is no pet," he said, his voice a mix of concern and understanding, "but I see you've already made up your mind. We'll care for it until it's strong enough to survive on its own." Emma named the cub Bruno, after a ranger in one of her grandfather's wilderness stories. From that day forward, her life revolved around nurturing the little bear. She fed him warm milk, fashioned a cozy sleeping space in the barn, and spent hours playing with him in the snow. As the weeks turned to months, Bruno grew stronger, his playful antics bringing joy to their quiet lives. Bruno was no ordinary cub. Despite his natural instincts, he developed a remarkable bond with Emma. He followed her everywhere, mimicking her actions and learning from her guidance. Emma, in turn, observed his behavior closely, learning the subtle language of grizzly bears. She taught him how to forage for berries, dig for roots, and climb trees. By the time Bruno was a year old, he had outgrown the barn and spent most of his time outdoors. Emma built a spacious enclosure for him, ensuring he had the freedom to explore while remaining safe from the dangers of the wild. Though Bruno was undeniably a bear, he seemed to regard Emma as part of his world, a bond forged in trust and care. As Bruno grew, so did Emma's understanding of her responsibility. Her grandfather often reminded her, "Emma, you're preparing him for a life without you. The wild is where he belongs." She knew he was right, but the thought of parting with Bruno weighed heavily on her heart. When Bruno turned 3, it was clear he was ready for the next chapter of his life. He had grown into a powerful young bear, his shoulders broad and his coat thick with the sheen of health. Emma and her grandfather decided it was time to release him back into the wild. On a cool autumn morning, Emma led Bruno deep into the forest, to a valley abundant with food and shelter. She knelt before him, tears streaming down her face as she whispered her goodbye. Bruno nuzzled her hand, his warm breath a silent acknowledgement of their bond. With a heavy heart, Emma watched as he turned and lumbered into the trees, his massive frame blending seamlessly with the wilderness. "Be free, Bruno," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Life without Bruno was an adjustment, but Emma found solace in her memories and the knowledge that she had done what was best for him. She pursued her passion for wildlife biology, earning a degree that allowed her to work with conservation groups dedicated to protecting grizzly bears. Her work was fulfilling, but the bond she had shared with Bruno remained unparalleled. Years passed, and Emma often wondered about Bruno. Had he adapted to the wild? Was he thriving? Though she had no way of knowing, she clung to the hope that he was living the life she had prepared him for. After nearly a decade away, Emma decided to return to her grandfather's cabin. She longed for the tranquility of the mountains and the chance to reconnect with the wilderness that had shaped her. The cabin, nestled in a grove of towering pines, was exactly as she remembered it. The forest welcomed her like an old friend, its trails and sounds familiar and comforting. One summer evening, Emma ventured deep into the woods, her backpack filled with field notes and supplies. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As she made her way back to the cabin, she noticed movement ahead. Two men emerged from the trees, their presence jarring against the natural backdrop. The men's intentions became clear as they demanded her belongings. Emma's heart raced as she clutched her backpack, filled with irreplaceable research. When she refused, one of the men grabbed her arm, his grip firm and threatening. Before she could react, a deep, resonant growl filled the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath as a massive grizzly bear emerged from the shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was Bruno. The robbers froze, their bravado evaporating as they faced the towering predator. Bruno's presence was commanding, his eyes locked on the men as he let out another earth-shaking growl. The men stumbled backward, fear etched on their faces. Realizing they were no match for the bear, they fled, disappearing into the forest. Bruno turned to Emma, his gaze softening. She stepped forward cautiously, her voice trembling with emotion. "Bruno, is it really you?" he rumbled softly, a sound she recognized as an acknowledgement. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Emma reached out, her hand brushing his thick fur. For a moment, it felt as if no time had passed. Emma spent the evening with Bruno in a clearing, sharing stories of her life and marveling at how he had grown. He stayed by her side, a silent guardian under the starlit sky. Though she knew he would eventually return to the wild, the time they shared was a gift she would cherish forever. As dawn broke, Emma knew it was time to say goodbye. She thanked Bruno for his loyalty and courage, her voice thick with emotion. With one last nuzzle, he turned and disappeared into the forest, a shadow among the trees. Emma's encounter with Bruno reinforced a profound truth. The bonds we form with nature can transcend time and distance. Her story became a symbol of the deep connection between humans and the wild, a reminder of the respect and care required to coexist with the natural world. She often shared her tale, emphasizing the importance of protecting wildlife and preserving their habitats. Nature, she would say, remembers kindness. It's up to us to ensure it thrives. The story of Emma and Bruno the girl and the grizzly remains a testament to the enduring power of trust, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and the wild. Story 2? Story 2. In the shadow of the sprawling mountain range, where pine trees swayed to the rhythm of the wind and rivers carved their way through ancient stone, lived a girl named Elise. Her family owned a small cabin on the edge of a forest so vast it seemed endless. She had grown up surrounded by the whispers of nature and the calls of the wild, but nothing had prepared her for the day she found the cub. Elise had been on one of her regular hikes, the kind where she lost herself in the tranquility of the woods. That afternoon, as sunlight dappled the forest floor, a faint, distressed sound caught her attention. Following the sound, she stumbled upon a tiny grizzly cub, trembling and alone, with no sign of its mother nearby. Its fur was scruffy, its eyes wide with fear, and its cries tugged at her heartstrings. Unable to walk away, Elise wrapped the cub in her jacket and carried it home. Her parents were hesitant at first, understanding the dangers of raising a wild animal, but they saw the determination in Elise's eyes. They agreed to let her care for the cub temporarily, but only until a wildlife rehabilitation center could take over. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Elise named the cub Rowan, and the bond they formed was nothing short of extraordinary. She fed him with a bottle, taught him how to forage for berries, and even built a small enclosure in their backyard to keep him safe as he grew. Rowan was mischievous but gentle, often curling up at Elise's feet as she read by the fire. Despite their deep connection, Elise knew from the start that Rowan belonged to the wild. By the time he was 2 years old, he had grown strong and confident. Elise worked tirelessly to prepare him for life in the forest, teaching him how to fish in the river and encouraging his natural instincts. When the day finally came to release him, Elise led Rowan to a remote clearing. With tears streaming down her face, she watched as he hesitated for a moment, looked back at her, and then disappeared into the trees. The years that followed were bittersweet. Elise missed Rowan every day, but she found solace in the thought that he was thriving in his natural habitat. She often wandered the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of her old friend, but Rowan had become a ghost of the wild, as elusive as the wind. 5 years passed, and Elise's life took a quieter turn. She worked as a local wildlife guide, sharing her love for nature with visitors to the area. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elise returned home from a long day to find her cabin's door slightly ajar. Alarmed, she stepped inside to discover her belongings scattered across the floor. 2 men were ransacking her home, their faces masked and their intentions clear. Fear gripped Elise, but she tried to remain calm. She backed away slowly, hoping to escape unnoticed, but the intruders spotted her. One of them grabbed her arm, their grip firm and unyielding. Panic surged through Elise as she struggled to free herself, her heart pounding like a drum. Just as she thought there was no way out, a deep guttural roar echoed through the night. The sound was so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. All 3 froze, their eyes darting to the doorway. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, stood a massive grizzly bear, its silhouette filling the frame. Elise's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the bear immediately. It was Rowan. The intruders, paralyzed with fear, released Elise and stumbled backward. Rowan stepped into the cabin, his presence commanding and his eyes locked on the men. With a series of intimidating growls, he advanced, forcing the intruders to retreat further until they bolted out the door and into the night. Elise sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a mix of relief and disbelief. Rowan turned to her, his expression softening. Despite his imposing size, he lowered his head and nuzzled her gently, just as he had when he was a cub. "Rowan," Elise whispered, her voice trembling. "You remembered me." For a moment, it felt as though time had stood still. The years apart melted away, leaving only the bond they had once shared. Elise ran her hand through his thick fur, marveling at how he had grown into such a magnificent creature. Rowan stayed with her until dawn, sitting quietly by her side as if to ensure she was safe. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, Rowan rose and looked toward the forest. Elise knew it was time for him to go. She watched as he lumbered back into the wilderness, his massive form blending seamlessly with the shadows of the trees. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread through the small mountain town. Many marveled at the story of the bear who had come to the rescue, while others were skeptical, dismissing it as a tall tale. But Elise knew the truth, and that was enough. She continued her work as a wildlife guide, her passion for the natural world stronger than ever. And, though she never saw Rowan again, she often felt his presence when she ventured into the forest. It was as if he was watching over her, a silent guardian of the girl who had once saved him. Elise's story became a local legend, a testament to the incredible bond that can exist between humans and animals, and every time she looked out at the vast expanse of the wilderness, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that somewhere out there, Rowan was thriving, wild and free. Story 3. In the shadow of the towering Rockies, a quiet man named Jack lived a solitary yet fulfilling life. His rustic cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was surrounded by a wilderness teeming with life. Jack had always been drawn to the harmony of nature, but his connection to the forest took a remarkable turn one chilly autumn morning years ago. Jack was out gathering firewood when he heard a faint rustling near the edge of the clearing. Cautiously approaching, he discovered a tiny black bear cub, alone and trembling. The little creature's glossy eyes mirrored both fear and exhaustion. Jack looked around for signs of its mother, but the forest was eerily silent. The cub's plight tugged at Jack's heartstrings, and though he knew the wild should remain wild, he couldn't leave the helpless creature behind. He carefully scooped up the cub and brought it back to his cabin. Over the coming weeks, Jack nursed the bear back to health. He named it Shadow, inspired by the cub's sleek, dark fur and the way it quietly followed him everywhere. Though he knew this arrangement couldn't last forever, Jack committed to giving Shadow a chance at survival. As months turned into years, Shadow grew from a timid cub into a formidable yet gentle creature. Jack made every effort to keep Shadow's instincts intact, encouraging him to forage for food and interact with the natural environment. The two developed an unspoken bond, a mutual understanding that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. Jack often talked to Shadow as if the bear could understand him. "One day, buddy, you'll go back where you belong," he would say, ruffling Shadow's fur. "But you'll always be family to me." Shadow would respond with a low, content rumble, as if acknowledging Jack's words. The day eventually came when Jack knew it was time to let Shadow go. With a heavy heart, he led the bear deep into the forest, to a place abundant with food and shelter. "This is your home now," Jack whispered. Shadow lingered for a moment, nuzzling Jack's hand before disappearing into the trees. Life returned to its quiet rhythm for Jack. He missed Shadow but took comfort in knowing the bear was thriving in the wild. Occasionally, he'd find signs of Shadow near the cabin, claw marks on a tree, or a familiar trail in the underbrush. But the bear kept his distance, as if understanding the need for separation. Years passed, and Jack's life remained peaceful until one fateful evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a dusky glow. Jack was sitting by his fireplace, lost in thought, when a sudden noise shattered the tranquility. The sound of footsteps and muffled voices outside his cabin put him on high alert. Before Jack could react, the door burst open and 3 shadowy figures barged in. Their faces were obscured, but their intentions were clear as they demanded money and valuables. Jack, though startled, remained calm, trying to reason with them. "I don't have much to give," he said, his voice steady. "Take what you want, but please, leave me in peace." The intruders weren't satisfied with his response and began ransacking the cabin. Jack's heart pounded as he realized the situation could spiral out of control. Just as one of the intruders turned towards him menacingly, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the darkness outside. The intruders froze, their eyes darting toward the open door. Out of the shadows emerged a massive black bear, its eyes glinting with a fierce, protective light. It was Shadow. The years had transformed him into a powerful force of nature, but his bond with Jack remained unbroken. Shadow let out a thunderous roar that sent the intruders scrambling. They backed away, tripping over furniture in their haste. The bear advanced with deliberate steps, his sheer presence enough to drive fear into their hearts. One by one, they fled into the forest, their shouts fading into the night. As the cabin fell silent, Shadow turned to Jack. Despite his intimidating display moments ago, the bear's eyes now held a familiar gentleness. Jack approached cautiously, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Shadow, is that really you?" The bear rumbled softly, lowering his massive head as Jack reached out to touch him. For a brief moment, it was as if time had rewound, and they were back to the days when Shadow was just a cub, seeking comfort. Jack spent the rest of the night marveling at the reunion. Shadow lingered near the cabin until dawn, as if ensuring Jack's safety before disappearing once more into the wilderness. Though Jack knew he might never see Shadow again, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. In the days that followed, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary bond he had shared with Shadow. The bear had returned at the exact moment he was needed most, proving that acts of kindness and love could transcend even the wildest of boundaries. Jack continued his life in the forest, cherishing the memory of his loyal guardian. And though Shadow had returned to the wild where he belonged, his presence remained a constant source of strength and inspiration for Jack, a reminder of the enduring connection between man and nature.